She had escaped the chains of her dark past, stepping into a life of luxury and love. The prince had saved her, offering her a new beginning, but no matter how far she ran, the ghosts of her past refused to let go. When shadows from her old life threatened to destroy everything, she realized, true freedom was not given, it had to be fought for. The night was cold, the wind howling through the silent streets as she pulled her tattered cloak tighter around her shoulders. Each step she took was cautious, her heart pounding in her chest as she darted between shadows. She had been running for years, fleeing from a past that refused to loosen its grip. But tonight felt different. A strange sense of finality settled over her, as if someone, was waiting just beyond the darkness. Her name was Amina, though she had long abandoned the identity that once belonged to an innocent girl. She had learned early on that survival meant forgetting who she was, shedding the fragile layers of the past. But memories had a way of clinging to the soul, and hers were carved too deep to erase. The marketplace was deserted at this hour, save for the flickering lanterns swaying in the night breeze. She moved swiftly, eyes scanning for an escape, though from what, she could not be certain. A deep instinct told her that danger lurked nearby, unseen but watching. The feeling had followed her for years, an unshakable presence, a shadow lurking in the corners of her vision. Then she saw them. 2 men, dressed in dark cloaks, standing at the end of the narrow street. Their gazes locked onto her, unyielding and cold. Amina's breath hitched, her body stiffening as her mind calculated the distance to the nearest alleyway. Her fingers curled around the small dagger hidden beneath her cloak. She had survived too long to surrender now. Before she could make her move, a new presence stepped between them. A man, tall and commanding, draped in a cloak that shimmered beneath the moonlight. His voice, firm yet composed, sliced through the tension. "Leave her be." The 2 figures hesitated, exchanging unreadable glances before retreating into the shadows. Amina remained frozen, her grip on the dagger tightening. She did not trust kindness, especially from a stranger. "You're safe now," the man spoke again, his tone gentler. "They won't return." She lifted her gaze, finally meeting his eyes. They were sharp, intelligent, carrying the weight of someone accustomed to power. His face was partially hidden beneath the hood of his cloak, but the glint of gold embroidery along his sleeves betrayed his status. A nobleman, perhaps. Or something more. "I don't need saving," she said, her voice guarded. He studied her for a moment before nodding. "Perhaps not. But that does not mean you deserve to be hunted like prey." She swallowed, unsure how to respond. There was an ease in his stance, a quiet authority that unsettled her. Men of status never intervened in matters that did not concern them. Why was he different? The silence stretched before he spoke again. "You're not from here." Amina's fingers twitched at her side. "No," she admitted. There was no point in lying. Everything about her screamed of displacement, the way she clung to the shadows, the foreign accent laced in her words, the scars she carried like an unspoken history. He exhaled, glancing towards the path the men had disappeared down. "They'll return," he said simply. "And next time, you may not be so fortunate." Amina's jaw tightened. "Why do you care?" For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable crossed his expression. "Because I know what it means to be chased by a past that refuses to die." The word struck a chord deep within her, a wound she had buried long ago. Before she could reply, he reached into his cloak, retrieving a small insignia ring. The crest was unmistakable, the royal sigil of the kingdom. Her breath caught. This was no ordinary noble. This was the prince. "Come with me," he offered. "You need protection." Amina took a step back, shaking her head. "I don't need your pity." "It's not pity," he corrected. "It's a choice." A choice. She had spent her life believing she had none. That fate had already written her story in blood and shadows. But now this stranger, this prince, was offering her something she had never dared to dream of. A way out. Amina glanced at the path behind her, where darkness stretched endlessly. Then she looked ahead, where the prince stood, waiting. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope. And she took his hand. Amina had expected the palace to feel suffocating, a gilded cage just as confining as the life she had escaped. Yet, as the days passed, she found herself in a world so foreign that it felt unreal. The grandeur of the towering marble walls, The scent of fresh jasmine that lingered in the halls, the hush of silk gliding across polished floors, everything was a stark contrast to the brutal streets she once knew. The prince, whose name she had learned was Idris, had not asked her for explanations. He had simply offered shelter, a place to rest, and, most unsettling of all, kindness. She wasn't used to kindness. It unnerved her more than the threats she had faced in the dark alleys of the city. Late one evening, Amina stood by the palace balcony, gazing at the moonlit gardens below. The air was thick with silence, interrupted only by the occasional chirp of crickets. Despite the warmth of her surroundings, a chill crept up her spine. Safety was a fragile thing, an illusion that crumbled when tested. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She turned as Idris stepped inside, his gaze calm yet watchful. "You don't sleep much," he noted. Amina hesitated before answering. "Sleep invites dreams. And I prefer not to dream." He studied her for a moment before walking to the opposite side of the balcony. "You've been here for weeks, yet you still look over your shoulder," he said, his voice quieter this time. She smirked faintly. "Old habits don't die easily." Idris leaned against the railing, his expression unreadable. "Who were they?" Amina knew he was referring to the men from that night, the ones who had tracked her through the streets like a predator stalking its prey. She had known they would not simply disappear. They never did. She exhaled slowly. "Ghosts." He didn't push for more, and she was grateful for that. Instead, he changed the subject. "The palace is safe. No one can harm you here." She almost laughed at the certainty in his voice. Safety was an illusion, one she had fallen for once before. It had cost her everything. "People like me," she murmured, "we don't get happy endings." Idris tilted his head slightly. "People like you." She met his gaze. "Survivors." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them carried an unspoken understanding. He knew there was more to her story, just as she sensed there was more to his. "You don't trust easily," he observed. "Neither do you," she countered. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Fair enough." The distant sound of footsteps echoed through the corridor. Amina tensed, instinctively stepping into the shadows, but Idris remained unfazed. A guard appeared in the doorway, bowing before speaking. "My lord, a message has arrived." "Urgent." Idris took the sealed parchment, his expression darkening as he read. Amina studied him carefully, the way his jaw tightened, the flicker of unease in his eyes. Something was wrong. She stepped closer. "What is it?" He hesitated before answering. "Trouble in the city. A group of men was seen asking questions about a woman matching your description." Amina's fingers curled into fists. They had found her. She turned away, her mind racing. She had made a mistake staying here. She had allowed herself to believe she was safe when, in reality, she had only put the prince and his people in danger. "I have to leave," she said suddenly. Idris frowned. "That's not an option." She spun to face him. "You don't understand. These men, they don't stop. They will burn this entire palace to the ground if it means getting to me." His gaze remained steady. "Then let them try." Amina faltered. "Why are you doing this? Why are you protecting me?" Idris exhaled slowly, setting the letter down. "Because you're not just running from them. You're running from yourself." The words struck deeper than she cared to admit. "You don't know anything about me," she said, voice barely above a whisper. He stepped closer, his presence grounding yet unyielding. "I know that no one should have to fight alone. And I know you've been fighting for far too long." Amina looked away, struggling against the emotions threatening to surface. It had been years since anyone had stood beside her, years since anyone had seen her as more than a burden. But trusting him meant risking everything. The illusion of safety had already begun to shatter. The ghosts of her past were coming, and this time there would be no running. She had to decide, fight or flee. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure which choice terrified her more. Amina knew this day would come. She had spent years running, slipping through cities like a whisper, never staying long enough to be noticed. But now, her past had found her. The illusion of safety had shattered the moment Idris received that message. There was no more time to pretend she could outrun the inevitable. She sat in the dimly lit chamber, the candlelight flickering against the stone walls. Her mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. If those men had tracked her to the palace, they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. And what they wanted was her. The door creaked open, and Idris stepped inside. His usual composed expression was hardened, his posture tense. He had spent the last few hours speaking with his guards, strengthening security, but Amina knew it wouldn't be enough. "They were seen near the eastern gates," he said, his voice low, "asking about a woman with dark eyes and a scar above her brow." Amina's fingers instinctively brushed against the faint mark on her forehead, a scar from a time she tried so hard to forget. "They won't stop," she murmured. "They never do." Idris studied her closely. "Then tell me who they are, Amina." She hesitated. For weeks, he had given her shelter, protection, and, strangely, a sense of belonging. But sharing the truth meant dragging him into a war he had no reason to fight. He must have sensed her reluctance. "If they're coming for you, then this isn't just your battle anymore," he continued. "You're under my protection now." Amina let out a hollow laugh. "You don't understand. Protection means nothing to men like them. They see it as an obstacle, nothing more." Idris crossed his arms. "Then let me be their obstacle." She wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe that the power of a prince could shield her. But her past had proven that men of power could be just as ruthless as the monsters hunting her. A deep breath steadied her nerves. "They're mercenaries," she finally admitted. "Hired blades who never fail to complete a job. Years ago, I was supposed to be one of their casualties. But I survived." Idris remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "They were sent to kill my family," she whispered, the weight of those words pressing against her chest. "And they succeeded." His expression darkened. "But not you." She shook her head. "I was supposed to die with them. But I ran. I hid. And they've been chasing me ever since." A long pause stretched between them. Idris spoke carefully. "Who sent them?" Amina's throat tightened. That was the question she had avoided for years. The answer was dangerous, more dangerous than the men hunting her. "I don't know his name," she admitted. "Only that he is powerful, ruthless, and patient. He doesn't send killers for no reason. There's something he wants from me, something I don't even understand." Idris clenched his jaw, frustration evident. "If you don't know what he wants, how do we fight him?" Amina exhaled slowly. "We don't. We run." He shook his head. "No. You've been running long enough." A knock interrupted their conversation. A guard stepped inside, his face grim. "My lord, a letter has arrived," he announced, extending a folded parchment sealed in black wax. "For the girl." Amina's breath caught in her throat. She didn't need to open it to know who it was from. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the message. The seal was unbroken, yet it felt like a noose tightening around her neck. Idris took a step closer. "Open it." She hesitated before peeling the wax apart, unfolding the paper. The message was short, written in an elegant but chilling script. "You cannot hide behind a prince. You know where this ends. Come willingly, or others will pay the price." Her stomach twisted. It was not a threat. It was a promise. Idris read over her shoulder, his expression turning to steel. "They want to draw you out." Amina swallowed hard. "And they know I won't let others suffer for me." Silence hung between them before Idris finally spoke. "Then we make them think they've won." She frowned. "What do you mean?" His eyes gleamed with determination. "We don't run. We don't hide. We set the trap." Amina stared at him, uncertainty warring with something she had long forgotten, hope. For the first time in years, she wasn't alone in this fight. But she also knew that the real battle was only beginning. Amina sat in the dim candlelight, staring at the ominous letter in her hands. The words echoed in her mind, "You know where this ends." She had spent years avoiding this confrontation, slipping through shadows, fleeing from place to place. But Idris was right. Running was no longer an option. She looked up at the prince, his sharp gaze unwavering. There was no fear in his eyes, only resolve. He had no reason to fight this battle, no personal stake in her past. yet he stood beside her as if it were his own war. A slow breath steadied her nerves. "How do we set the trap?" Idris folded his arms. "We make them believe you're surrendering." Amina frowned. "They won't fall for a simple deception. They expect me to come alone." "And that's exactly what they'll think you're doing," he replied. "But they don't know me. They don't know my men. We will control the battlefield, not them." She studied him carefully. He was a prince, raised in the world of politics and power. But there was something else beneath his royal exterior, a strategist, a warrior who understood the weight of calculated risks. Amina exhaled. "Where do we start?" Idris turned to his guards. "Double the patrols around the palace. I want our fastest riders positioned beyond the city walls. If anything goes wrong, we need an escape route." The guards bowed and hurried away, leaving Amina alone with him. His gaze softened. "Are you ready for this?" She wanted to say no, wanted to cling to the false comfort of running. But she had been running her entire life, and it had only led her here. She had no choice but to fight. "I'm ready," she whispered. The ambush. The next night, Amina stood at the edge of the abandoned ruins outside the city. The moon cast long shadows over the crumbling stone walls, the air thick with tension. She had sent word to the mercenaries, agreeing to meet on their terms. Her heart pounded as she waited, every instinct screaming that danger was near. But she wasn't alone. Idris and his guards were hidden in the surrounding darkness, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. A sudden rustle of movement sent a chill down her spine. Figures emerged from the shadows. 5, no, 6 of them. All dressed in dark cloaks, their faces masked, their steps deliberate. One man stepped forward, taller than the rest, his voice smooth yet laced with menace. "Amina." She forced herself to stand tall. "I'm here." The man chuckled. "Brave. Or foolish. Either way, you should have never come." Her fingers curled into fists. "What do you want from me?" His smile didn't reach his eyes. "You already know." "He still wants you." Amina's stomach twisted. She had never seen the face of the man who sent them, the one who had ordered the massacre of her family. But he had spent years hunting her like she was nothing more than unfinished business. She took a steady breath. "And if I refuse?" The man tilted his head. "Then we burn this city to the ground. And you will still end up in his hands." Amina clenched her jaw. "Not tonight." The signal was subtle, a flick of her wrist, a movement small enough to go unnoticed. But it was enough. An arrow sliced through the air, striking one of the mercenaries before he could react. Chaos erupted. Idris' men surged from the shadows, swords clashing against steel. Amina wasted no time. She lunged forward, grabbing the dagger hidden beneath her cloak, and struck the nearest attacker. He staggered back, but another took his place. A sharp whistle cut through the air. Idris. She caught a glimpse of him in the chaos, his blade moving with precision, taking down enemy after enemy. The leader of the mercenaries turned to flee, but Amina was faster. She darted after him, her pulse pounding. "You don't get to walk away from this," she hissed. He sneered. "You think killing me will stop him? He will never stop looking for you." She met his gaze, her grip tightening on her dagger. "Then let him come." Without hesitation, she drove the blade into his chest. His body slumped to the ground, the fight leaving his eyes. Silence followed. The last of the mercenaries had fallen. Amina turned, breathing heavily. Idris approached, his sword still in hand. "It's over." She exhaled. For now. A new beginning. Back at the palace, Amina stood on the balcony, watching the horizon. The battle was won, but she knew this was far from over. The man who had sent them was still out there, still waiting. Idris joined her, standing quietly for a moment before speaking. "You don't have to run anymore." Amina turned to him. "I know. But this isn't finished." He nodded. "Then we finish it together." She searched his gaze, finding something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: trust. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid. The end.